to do a thought experiment with you. If you were writing the history of a new movement that you were hoping would take the message of Jesus around the world, how would you write that story? Chances are you may shy away from controversial things when you're writing down the account or telling other people about the early history of the church. You may not include conflicts between two key leaders in the early church, right? We have a tendency to sometimes whitewash history or make it feel like things that were confrontational weren't that big of a deal sometimes. You know what I'm talking about. It's interesting that when Luke is telling the story of the early church, he is very specific about the details that he chooses to include. We've seen that all along. And one of the details that he chooses to include is why Paul and Barnabas decide to part ways. These are two of the biggest movers and shakers of the early Christian movement, particularly how it relates to the Gentile believers who are just coming on board. And we're told that these two men have a disagreement that's so strong that they can't reconcile, that they actually end up parting ways. Now, on the surface, this disagreement centers around a man named John Mark. John Mark was a traveling companion with them, but he left somewhere around Acts 13, and we're not exactly told why, but we get a little hint from Luke. We're told John Mark goes back to Jerusalem. And so we've just had the Jerusalem Council. We've just seemingly resolved all the tensions between those who think that the Gentiles need to become Jewish in order to follow Jesus, and those that think they can follow Jesus without doing some of the stereotypical Jewish things like circumcision and food laws and some of those other traditional cultural Jewish type practices. Now we see that what we thought was resolved is actually still just beneath the surface, starting to be worked out in practice. And the decision over John Mark, I think, is actually a decision about, are you going to be all in or not? Paul wants to surround himself, it seems at least, with people who are on board, who have no issue welcoming the Gentiles into the circle of God's family, regardless of whether or not they convert to Judaism or not. Barnabas wants to give John Mark another chance. If it's true that John Mark deserted because he wasn't comfortable with how the Gentiles were being brought in, Paul sees a little bit of trouble with that, continuing to work with him. Barnabas wants to give him a second chance. And I think that's really the conversation that's at the surface. Underneath this all is, how are we going to continue responding to the Gentile believers? And are we going to take to them representatives who are fully on board? And wherever you kind of fall in this tension of whether you think Paul's right and we can't trust John Mark to come along anymore, or whether you think that you're on the side of Barnabas, you would have given him another chance to prove himself. It doesn't matter. They split ways. And what I love about this is Luke isn't actually painting Paul up to be a hero in this story, or is he painting Barnabas out to be a hero? What I think this does is include an episode that it's clear to see is actually tragic when it comes to the church. These two key leaders who separate, they part ways, they can't get along, and now their ministries are going to go not in opposite directions, but certainly geographically in different directions. And I like this story being included, one, because it shows us the real history of how this stuff happened. It makes me more easily able to believe these accounts because, again, they're including the good and the ugly as well. But I also think it reminds me that you don't have to be perfect to serve God. Here are two men who have just come through a council on a really controversial topic where everyone came to agreement. And now they're separating because of a separate disagreement. These are two men who I would think should be mature enough to handle their disagreements and come back to the table together, and they can't for whatever reason. And I just, again, it goes to show you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to be without conflict in order to follow Jesus, and not only just follow Jesus, but be used for incredible things. Both of these men are going to go on in the early church to do incredible things. I mean, how much of our New Testament do we owe the works of Paul happening right now as we're reading Acts, is when he's starting to pen all these letters and send them out to these churches that he is visiting. We're seeing the New Testament in action. And it's all happening in the context of where Paul is still making mistakes. He's still experiencing these conflicts. In other words, he's human, just like you and I are human. So if you've ever doubted or thought that you had to have it all together, or that you couldn't make mistakes and be used by God, this story shows us that's just frankly not true. And I love, love, love that as Luke is penning this history of the early church, he's not afraid to tell it like it is and include episodes like these. I hope as you reflect back on your journey of faith, both where you've been and where you are currently, that you'll be honest with where you are, honest with the things that you're struggling with, because God can handle those things, and he wants to use you no matter where you are currently to make a real impact in this world. I hope that blesses you this morning as we continue reading through this incredible journey that is the gospel or the book of Acts.